Thanks for coming, and thanks too to our panelists. I had baked in a joke here about Owen being late, but he just made it on time. I was going to take the piss out of the, argument that everyone seems to be making. The reason they're late today is because of privatized trains and not their own actual inability to get things together. It's great to have such a turnout for this event, where we finally, after many months of work, get to say Tribune is back. I'm Ronan Burtenshaw, Tribune's new editor, and I'll be introducing both the Relaunch publication and tonight's panel. All of those on stage with me have contributed to our Relaunch issue. Dawn Foster, who wrote eviscerating commentary about Food Bank Britain. Grace Blakeley, who continued her campaign against the financialization of our economy. Owen Jones, who wrote about Clause 4 and the need to recommit to socialist politics in the 21st century. And I especially want to pay tribute to Professor David Harvey, who has not only been writing recently, or for us, but has a record going back many, many years of Marxist and socialist writing in some of the darkest times for our movement, keeping the flame alive, and I know in my case, helping me to understand the world as an 18-year-old in the context of the Great Crash, the financial crisis, and all of the injustice that followed. So I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. So, to the question I think we've been asked more than any other since we went live earlier this week. What are you doing? Why are you relaunching Tribune? Why not start a new magazine? It's something actually we thought about a lot before the project began. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and particularly about tradition and the left in my remarks. There's been a lot of discussion on the international left in recent years about the need for new movements, new projects, in some cases new parties. And it's understandable, I think, as an impulse. By the time many of my generation came through to the left, decades of defeat had left it looking, in many ways, dilapidated. And yet, amid all that discussion of new things, we sit here today at an event made possible by an organization, made possible by the ascent of a veteran socialist of decades' experience to the leadership of the Labour Party. And it's not just here, as Bernie Sanders in the United States shows, where the left's zeal for the new failed to predict what would actually be its greatest strength in this generation: the enduring relevance of our historic arguments. I think these have been important lessons for us, not as a way of saying close off new thinking or to refuse to learn from the failures of the past, but to pay attention again to the importance of heritage, of our heritage, and the movements that came before us. Our opponents often seek to caricature our movement, our history, our tradition. For many years, socialists were dinosaurs. Today, we're young and naive. We've been called a rabble, a mob, derided for our protests at the world's injustice, mocked for the principles that we held. They want us to forget the real history of our tradition. But we remember. We remember that it was mass movements of working people that broke the divine right of kings. It was mass movements that won civil liberties and abolished the torture chambers. It was mass movements that won our democratic rights, that popularized culture, that secured the rights of women to vote and LGBT people to some degree of equality in our society, that built the trade unions and the NHS, that brought down empire, that won almost every reform that makes our society worth living in. This is our heritage. They want us to forget it, but we remember. Tribune played its role in those movements. Founded in 1937, it committed itself to fight the rise of fascism, first in Spain, where George Orwell made such a memorable contribution, and then across Europe by the construction of a popular front, with Stafford Cripps telling us it was through united action alone that the working class can win victory in our country and in the world. It was Tribunite Nye Bevan who oversaw the construction of the National Health Service, a crusade, he said, to overcome the hedonism of capitalist society by removing healthcare from the predations of the market. Jenny Lee, far too often relegated to a role as Nye's wife, was in fact a pioneering Minister for the Arts who helped open up the Open University and its benefits of advanced education for millions. Ellen Wilkinson was one of the earliest campaigners on behalf of working women, bringing light to the dreadful conditions many face not only in the workplace but at home. Barbara Castle oversaw the introduction of the Equal Pay Act and fought on behalf of children and of families abandoned by the Tories to deprivation, saying that anxiety and poverty will be the portion of thousands of families as long as capitalism lasts. Tribune was also at the forefront of the campaign against Enoch Powell and the National Front which followed him, something which stemmed from its role as a prominent supporter of anti-colonial movements. Jawaharlal Nehru wrote in Tribune in 1938 that Labour must be anti-imperialist as well as anti-fascist, that it must oppose empire and declare for the independence of India. Albert Luthuli, the president of the African National Congress, challenged the British left to fight apartheid back in 1961. Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, wrote of the limitations of independence under capitalism. And my compatriot, Sean O'Casey, the first secretary of the first working class army in the world, the Irish Citizen Army, was afforded a space to make the case for the rights of Irish people, along with giants such as Jamaican socialist Michael Manley. Tribune also had its faults, for sure. We're not going to ignore those. And there are many times when it failed to be bold enough fighting for socialist positions. But even in those days, through the travails of the 80s and the 90s, it produced writers like Chris Mullen, Paul Anderson, and Mark Seddon, my predecessor Chris. Even in its darkest years, Tribune understood that great declaration from Walter Crane, that the cause of labour is the hope of the world. As we enter the 10th year of capitalist crisis, overseeing the rise of a renewed far right, the relaunch of Tribune is our own declaration that the historic analysis of the left has been vindicated by the last 100 years, not disproven. We are rebuilding this institution because it has, and all of us have, unfinished business. As long as capitalism endures, Tribune, as Michael Foot said, believes in sustaining the old cause with the old weapons. We are socialist and we are proud of it. I want to pay tribute to those who've helped me put this together, to Bhaskar, our publisher, to Ramike and Lauren, who did such an excellent job on design, to Kea for production, Ashia for distribution, Owen, our culture editor, and to Marcus, without whom we would never have got to this point. Tribune is not something, and tradition is not something that exists outside of us, but something that runs through all of us in this room. And to that end, I also want to say thanks to my ma, who's out here somewhere, who I've neglected over the last few months in the building of this project. My ma was a fighter for abortion rights in Ireland when that was a very difficult thing to do as a young mother receiving death threats to her place of work. She was also a shop steward who organised her colleagues out of poverty pay and into decent working conditions, and her father was a trade union man as well, growing up in the tenements of Dublin, going to work at age 11, organising the kitchens that he worked in, pulling them out of the abominable conditions that they were in, and being recognised for the life service he gave to his union. That's my tradition. It's one I was raised in, it's one that is written into my bones, and as long as I'm the editor of Tribune, it's one I'll fight for. And so, Tribune is relaunched. We can only survive with the support of subscribers, more than 1,500 of which have already signed up. We appreciate your support enormously, and we will bust a gut to give you the magazine you all deserve. But we need many more to achieve our ambitions of a socialist publication that can truly challenge the giants of the British press. So, pass the word on to your friends and comrades. Tell them Tribune is out there again, fighting for socialism, and that we need your help. Tell them that we carry Michael Foot's message, that the values of capitalist society are profoundly evil, and that socialism means nothing if it does not mean shaking capitalism to its foundations. Tell them we believe we'll see socialism in our time, because we will, and we'll do it together. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah, okay, good. In about 6 weeks' time, I'll be 83 years old, and I aim to be around till I'm 90. And that means to me I have room for a 7-year project. And I think, by the way, this is rather important, that we start to think of at least the longue durée and long-term transformations. After all, in my own lifetime, I've seen the movement to neoliberalism, which took maybe 15, 20 years to really consolidate and to be transformed into where it's at right now. And I think we on the left need to have, in our minds at least, the idea of the long-term project. The difficulty, of course, for I'm sure everybody in this room, and I would include myself in this, that usually the particular problem that we're facing in our workplace or in our politics or wherever is so pressing that we really don't have much time to sit back and think about the long-term project. And one of the things I hope from Tribune is that it will pay attention to a long-term project and think about this as a move towards a more socialist society. So that by the time I'm 90, I want you all and me to have created a different kind of society to the one we are living in right now. And that is going to take careful thinking and reflection on what it is we're doing, how sometimes we get pushed into political activism in a certain way only to find at a certain point what we've been doing has been co-opted by capital into something completely different. Think, for example, of the early stages of the internet and all of that, where everybody thought this was an opening towards a more democratic, socialist, peer-to-peer, decentralized world. And look who we've got. We've got Google and all the rest of it, tremendous concentrations of media power. And this is one of the things that I've learned over my lifetime. There's no such thing as a good idea on the left that capital at a certain point doesn't manage to co-opt. And we have to be flexible. We have to be dynamic. We have to move fast. because that's what capital does. The left sometimes is very conservative. We've got our position, that's it. And while there is strength in holding to a position and maintaining solidarities, there can also become a weakness when those solidarities crystallize into dogmatic positions. Because when a very dynamic, flexible force confronts a solid object, the solid object usually disappears. And I think the left has to recognize that. Again, I would hope that Tribune would try to carve out for itself a very special niche where these long-term questions get addressed. And long-term analyses and deep analyses are worked through. For instance, if I look at the program of Momentum, many, many different sessions, and sessions which are dealing with questions of oppressions, questions of exclusions, questions of forms of domination, which need to be confronted. But I didn't really see very much about how are we going to reorganize the world of production, consumption, and distribution in a more egalitarian way. How are we going to actually arrive in 7 years' time at a world in which socialism is hegemonic as opposed to where it lies now, which is a rather easily countered force by the right. And in this, again, there are two things. One, to analyze the situation where we're at now and what is happening and have a very clear understanding of that, and have an understanding of what the motion looks like and where it's going. And in my own work, I've been trying to do some of that. In 2005, I published a book on the brief history of neoliberalism. I'm trying to write a second edition of it because things have changed since 2004, 2005. But in that book, I argued that neoliberalism was a class project. And as a class project, it was about the accumulation of wealth and power within corporate and wealthy owners and the like. And that was very clear in the 1970s, particularly in the United States, where we saw a strategy, a real strategy to capture institutions. The universities were too radical, so build think tanks all around the university. Surround the university and gradually erode the university until eventually the university collapsed under the force of neoliberal dogma. And watching that happen over a long period of time, you realize there was this strategy there. That strategy, of course, carried over into culture and governmentality and all the rest of it. So you get many accounts of neoliberalism now that isolate one or other aspect of what is happening as if it is the single bullet. But for me, the single bullet was the main force, was this capitalist class power and what it was doing. And let me say something about this, because just recently, one of the most powerful families in the United States, the Koch brothers, one of the brothers kind of said, we've had the best 5 years ever. And it's interesting, he said 5 years, not just Trump, but before that. And that was because they funded the Tea Party. They didn't make the Tea Party was there, but they funded it. They funded it big time. And the purpose of the Tea Party was to create chaos in Washington. Such chaos that nothing could get done. Everybody would then be frustrated with politics, become alienated from political life. And you can see coming out of this then the election of Donald Trump. And it's interesting. For all of the craziness of Trump, what has he done? He's destroyed the Environmental Protection Agency. He's destroyed occupational safety and health. He's destroyed labour rights. He's reconfigured education in such a way that it's about privatisation of education. He passed a tax bill which is a gift to the bondholders. He's done everything that's in the neoliberal playbook. Everything. And they're intensely grateful to him. They disagree with him on free trade and they disagree with him on immigration, but what he's done for them is something fantastic. So that in 2007, 2008, when the neoliberal project lost its legitimacy because it did not deliver on what had been promised from the 1970s onwards, it then moved one step further that back in the book on neoliberalism I'd already identified, which was the neoliberal project is in danger of losing its legitimacy, so it needs to have political support, so it moved into alliance with the movement at that time known as neoconservatism. The neocons were there. And therefore, this alliance between neoliberal and neocon came strong. The neocons, of course, got discredited in many ways by all this stuff about imperialism and the invasion of Iraq and all the rest of it. And by the way, on that, everybody complains about Donald Trump and lies and all the rest of it. Yeah, he lies through his teeth. But the two biggest lies that have been told in this century are first, the lie about Iraq and the war. And that lie has had consequences that are with us today. I mean, this is a world historical lie. I mean, Trump lies about everything, you know, his sexual life and God knows what. But the lie about Iraq was huge in terms of its implications. The second big lie was that free markets actually deliver benefits to all. The hidden hand of the market is actually beneficial to everyone. Well, what Marx shows in Capital Volume 1 is that's not the case. A free market actually delivers wealth to the upper classes and misery to everybody else. And it's no accident the most powerful country and the most powerful leaders always advocate for free markets, like the Koch brothers do now. Because they're the ones that benefit. They're the ones who can use that. But that became unstuck in 2007, 2008, which then led, if you like, to the growing consensus right now of neoliberalization being perpetuated through ethno-nationalism. And it's interesting, the German right wing, very interesting paper I've just read, has formally adopted neoliberal principles of economy as part of its doctrine. The same is going on in Italy. This is what Bannon and that is about in the United States. So the neoliberal project, which is about the wealthy getting wealthier, the neoliberal project is alive and well, but it no longer has the legitimacy it had back in the 1980s, when it could actually brag it was about freedom and liberty and flexibility and openness, all of those things which seduced many people on the left. Many people on the left went along with flexible specialization back in the sort of 1980s and said this is beneficial. Many feminists got seduced into thinking that this neoliberal thing was an opening to a new form of entrepreneurialism of the self and governmentality and all the rest of it. But those days are over. As Nancy Fraser said recently, the feminist movement now recognizes that whole thing about neoliberalism was a scam and a sham. And we now have to actually start to rebuild an anti-neoliberal, which is also anti-capitalist. And this, again, I think is something that's terribly important, which is in the long run we have to think about an anti-capitalist struggle which is going to take many years to unfold. But we cannot do pieces without looking at the relationship of the pieces we're engaged in relation to the whole, which again I think requires an intellectual and a theoretical frame and a framing of what we're doing. so that we understand better how what we're doing relates to what somebody else is doing. There are people in the environmental movement. How well do they relate to people in the labor movement? How well do people who are working on questions of social reproduction, how well do they relate to people who are dealing with questions of realization and distribution and the like? And how do we deal with what seems to me to be, again, one of the huge pressing problems of our time, which is the creation of what I call debt peonage? That the rising indebtedness, particularly throughout the Western world, that crisis of 2007, 2008 was a crisis of the financial system. And that financial crisis has been gotten out of by creating more and more financial instruments. In fact, what we've got is a Ponzi economy. Debt is being used to retire debt. The global indebtedness now stands at something like close to 300% of GDP, which in the 1970s would have been unthinkable, unheard of. And as the famous sort of statement about indebted homeowners goes, indebted people don't go on strike. Indebted people are, in effect, imprisoned in their indebtedness. We see that with the student body in the United States that owes about $1.1 trillion. And if you kind of say to them, well, you know, let's go out in the streets and get radical and let's confront the corporations and all the rest of it, the answer is, I've got to pay off my debt. I don't have a life for 20 years after I leave college because I've got to pay off my debt. So these are the kinds of things which exist right now, which have to be thought about in terms of what and how are we going to actually deal with the power of the financial system. As Marx pointed out, the financial system does not directly relate to workers. I mean, in the Russian Revolution, they could storm the Winter Palace. In the French Revolution, they stormed the Bastille. Are we going to storm the Bank of England? And what would we do if we did storm the Bank of England when we got inside there? Actually, that's one of the big issues. And actually, going back to the Paris Commune, one of the things that Lenin said about the Paris Commune was they never took the Bank of France. The communards kept the Bank of France and they protected it. And Lenin said they were crazy, they should have taken it and used it. But then, if you ask of Lenin the question, what would you do with it? The answer is, well, we're not quite sure. So what would we do if we stormed the Bank of England and took it over? It's a nice thought. But we would probably sit there and say, well, maybe, you know. So there are issues right now. I think that through these analyses of the relationships between, for instance, indebtedness, the growing coordination that's going on between the neoliberal project, Koch brothers and all the rich folk actually nestling in with ethno-nationalism and all the rest of it, all of this stuff that's going on in, you know, Hungary and Poland and India and Turkey and in the United States. And by the way, one of the important ways in which this comes about is by creating chaos. That the deliberate creation of chaos is one of the vehicles that allows the Churchillian moment to arise where the great person is going to come in and sort it all out. So watch it, because if you have a chaotic Brexit, you'll soon have Boris Johnson as the big savior of the system. Seriously. And this is not, this is something that has to be looked at, not simply in terms of, okay, well, it's again, we've got to be anti-fascist and all the rest of it, which of course there's a long tradition of. We have to think about the vehicle and the reasons why the neoliberal project is merging with the ethno-nationalist project right now. And what that means for our political futures, and to what degree that is the barrier that has to be surmounted over the next 7 years if we're going to get to the fact that when I'm 90, we'll all be living in a socialist paradise. Thank you.
told to stand up, so I'll do as I'm told for a change. I'm not going to talk about what's going to happen when I'm 90, because who knows? It'll be great. I'm sure it'll be wonderful. So I'd like to thank Ronan and everybody here for inviting me along. I'm very, very excited about Tribune's relaunch, not least because there are a lot of gaps in our media that need to be filled, and Tribune is in a much better position than many other places to fill them. So for the entirety of my short journalistic career, we've lived under austerity. I first started writing in about 2012 when George Osborne was Chancellor. And I spend a lot of time writing about politics, but I also spend a lot of time writing about social affairs, poverty, inequality, all sorts of kind of social issues that affect people in society. And one thing that I find quite frustrating about this coverage is the kind of tone, tenor of it, and the manner in which it happens. I grew up in the early 90s under John Major in a single-parent family with a couple of kids on benefits, and remember just constantly being hungry. Remember during the summer the fact that you didn't have free school meals meant that the summer was extremely stressful and you were actually relieved to go back to school rather than enjoying your holidays. And now I have to write about it again. And my siblings are actually in a worse position than I was when I was their age. My youngest sibling was born when I was 18, so she's about 12 now, and she's in a worse position in terms of, you know, the economics of my local area than I was when I was her age. And it becomes really, really cyclical, but the problem is that all of the coverage in the media doesn't really reflect that. Part of it obviously comes from the fact that people like me are relatively rare in the media. I went to a Russell Group university, never do that, but I didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, which makes me strangely rare, you know, especially compared to wider society where still, you know, more than half the population haven't been to university. And often when you do look at the coverage of poverty, inequality, or food banks, as I've written about in Tribune, rather than get a kind of real deep sense of what's going on with these things, it turns into a kind of Elizabeth Gaskell, the mill owner's wife, goes down to look at the terrible conditions and, you know, opines about how awful it is and then goes back to their manor house and, you know. Whereas what I hope Tribune will do, and what Ronan allowed me to do, was to look at the fact that actually all of these things affect individuals, so food banks and austerity affect individual lives, but they also say a lot more about the system that we're in. So if you end up in a food bank, obviously society has failed you, and you know we should all, you know, when it comes to homelessness, when it comes to poverty, when it comes to food poverty, fuel poverty, all sorts of poverty, and now we have period poverty. It's brilliant. There's going to be a new one every few months, don't worry. When it comes to these things, society has failed you, and that shouldn't be the case. We are the 6th richest society in Britain at the moment, in the globe, fallen from the 5th. But we're still failing a huge section of our society. And when you sit in food banks, you see a huge number of people. I saw a lot of nurses. I saw several bankers who were spending all of their money on rent and still weren't able to make ends meet at the end of the month. And I saw like a massive, massive cross-section of society. And that's often the only story you're told. What you're not told then is what happens to you as an individual when you are subjected to that poverty. So, I mean, you know, David mentioned it briefly when he talked about debt, but when it comes to poverty, it really, really does chip away at your entire identity. And it helps capitalism because you feel more insular. You don't want to talk about the issues that are affecting you. You blame yourself rather than society, rather than the fact that we have an economic system that means that even if you're working full-time, you still can't feed your children. Even if you're working in the NHS saving lives every day, you can't afford to put food on the table. And that's a function of austerity. It's not a kind of accidental byproduct. It's the exact function of it. And when you look at the individual stories, you get a real sense of how society is just collapsing around us, and the fact that it's clearly designed to do that just to enrich, you know, more people at the top. I was talking to a woman who lives in the home counties in a estate near a relatively affluent area. Her downstairs neighbour, she lives in a maisonette, and the 38-year-old man who lives on the floor below her, killed himself about 4 months ago. He became extremely disabled. He had mental and physical disabilities after he stepped in to stop a machete attack on a pensioner. He was really incredibly disabled afterwards. He suffered horrendous injuries. And shortly afterwards, his girlfriend was involved in a car crash in which his young child died. They broke up as a result of the death and also his disability. He was claiming benefits for several years and had a relatively okay life. He had very simple pleasures, and he was able to fund them. He liked going to the local garden centre, took buses there. He was a landscape gardener before his accident, and he liked going to the zoo. He liked going to local farms. He liked animals. He liked, very small pleasures that didn't take a lot of money, but gave his life some purpose. He was assessed for personal independence payments, which is part of the new landscape of reevaluating every form of benefit. And when he got a letter back, he had to get somebody to help him read it, and he was told that his condition was improving, or was expected to improve, therefore his money would be cut. When he died, he had almost no money in his bank account. His washing machine was held together with a huge amount of sellotape because it was collapsing, and the coroner mentioned that they found a huge number of post-it notes that he'd written when he was drafting letters to the DWP, trying to explain that he felt he had no reason to live anymore. He couldn't afford anything. He could barely eat. He couldn't afford any form of kind of social life whatsoever. And there are thousands of those stories, and they all fit together, and they all show that actually, when it comes down to it, austerity is, absolutely designed to crush the very poorest and convince people that they have no worth, and completely destroy solidarity between people because you feel so completely and utterly ashamed of yourself. And I think that we need more curiosity about what the personal effects of those things are and how we can actually get out of those. So I've spoken to some people in trade unions who have started to look at ways of involving people who aren't in work or who are disabled or who are not able to contribute to unions in the normal kind of monthly direct debit sort of style, to try and get them involved in campaigning, to try and get them involved in fighting back. And a couple of years ago, I spoke to some people who were involved in Unite, who were able to form a union of unemployed people and were able to get appeals against the bedroom tax. It was very difficult to actually get that story published, mainly because my editors were like, well, who actually cares about a small branch of unions and a couple of bedroom tax, complaints, etc. But I think we need that curiosity, and I think we need, a way to actually look at the alternatives and a way to actually look at how we can build solidarity amongst other people again. Because one thing I remember about being a young child and growing up very poor was constantly being reminded, I was never verbally reminded by anybody I knew, but I subconsciously knew that if I ever mentioned the fact that we lived in poverty, that during the winter we couldn't turn the heating on, that often we just had to skip meals, etc., that I was reminded over and over again that I should never tell other people, we should constantly hide that. When actually there were probably lots of other children in my classroom who were going through the same thing. And it would have been helpful if we knew that. It would have been helpful if I felt less alone in that. And, it probably would have helped our teachers as well to know exactly what we were going through. And I think the mainstream media ignores that. The mainstream media doesn't really care about poverty. It doesn't really care about exactly how poverty functions and how it perpetuates inequality. And I hope that Tribune will continue to allow people to look into the wider problems around austerity, the wider problems around inequality. And at the moment, it seems like a hotbed of curiosity, and I'm very excited for it.
So I'm going to stand up here and argue today that ideas matter. And they're not the only thing that matters, but they do matter. And they matter at certain times more than others. And I've got an example of, I'm going to try and read off this. An example of an idea that mattered and that changed the course of history, fairly recently actually. So in the aftermath of 2007, there were these two economists called Reinhardt and Rogoff. And they'd released a book about the crisis, and they thought, oh, their book it sold really well, so they were like, we're going to do a study off the back of this. And they released a study that purported to show that past 90% of GDP, public debt has a significant negative impact on growth. Now, the MSM, the mainstream media, picked this up, and they ran with it. George Osborne said that he was a massive fan of these two economists. And kind of more particularly, the German government picked this up, and they didn't really need an austerity program at this point. They hadn't got the massive debt levels that other people had. But they used this to implement a kind of preemptive austerity program to stop their debts from reaching this level of 90% of GDP. There was just one problem. It was wrong. They'd done their stats wrong. When you ran the regression and you included all the other data that they'd excluded, and there were a couple of errors in the Excel sheets, when you reran the regression, there was no relationship. Of course, that didn't really matter, because whilst ideas matter, as good materialists, we know that power matters too. And at that particular point in time, there were, the global economy was going through what appeared to be a kind of a meltdown, what was a meltdown. And public debt was at the center of everything because of what was going on in Greece. And, ultimately we know that analogy was wrong, that what was happening in Greece only happened because the ECB was failing to buy Greek bonds in the way that any other central bank would step in to buy bonds in a parallel scenario. But the Reinhardt and Rogoff thesis chimed with what was going on in Greece to allow a certain section of our society, of actually the global society, of global capitalism, to continue to pursue a project that they'd been pursuing since the 1980s, but which had kind of got off track a little bit in particular places between the 90s and the noughties. Because what some saw what had happened in the 1990s and the 2000s as a kind of affront to the Thatcherite project, to neoliberalism that had won in the 1980s. And they saw this kind of gorging, this increase in the size of the state as something that was to be avoided at all costs. And people in the UK, like David Cameron, they said that. There was this whole argument back in the day. There were those of us who went out and said austerity is a political project, not an economic necessity, and we were derided. We were given Reinhardt and Rogoff and said, this is ridiculous. But David Cameron had said explicitly, austerity is a way for us to permanently reduce the size of the state. And the reason that the state had grown up to that point, and the reason that these guys were so annoyed is kind of insane, because, what had happened, the state had grown on the back of gorging itself on the revenues from a finance sector that had been released by Thatcher herself. We saw, a growth in in financial profits in this country from 1.5% of total profits in 1970 to about 15% in the run-up to the financial crisis. A lot of that revenue went into the state, and Blair's whole project was aimed at taking some of those revenues and reducing to some extent or another the massive disparities in wealth that had opened up as a result of neoliberalism. My piece in Tribune this week looks at the financialization of the housing market that came along with this. And this, again, a massive political project. Thatcher decided that, in order to do what she really wanted to do, which was break labor, enrich capital, she would create this class of mini-capitalists. She would extend the benefits of asset ownership towards a large swathe of the population, and by releasing the debt machine that we saw after the 1980s, allow people to borrow tons of money to buy their own houses. Ultimately, of course, creating a kind of debt crisis that exploded in 2007. But as I was saying, in the intervening time, the state had grown a little bit. And there were people that didn't particularly like that. The public services were working pretty well. There was still this distinction in welfare between the deserving and the undeserving poor, which is, of course, what allows the state to maintain their kind of discipline that they need to keep people in work. But ultimately, as Dawn was saying, things weren't as bad as they are today. And so, of course, confronting this project, people saw a kind of an attempt to go back to the bad old days before Thatcher. And Thatcher herself, her acolytes had said that what their project was an attempt to do was not just to enrich capital, it was to massively increase the reserve army of labour, to basically break the labour movement, break the unions, and make sure that there were always enough people who were poor and desperate enough to go to work for whatever wage capitalists wanted to pay them. And so this is where austerity came in. It's a project to shrink the size of the state, increase the reserve army of labour again, You know, it was a project that was informed by the power relations that existed in that society at that time. So it kind of probably would have happened anyway. But that thesis, that 90% of GDP target, it mattered. It was literally written in to the German government's austerity program. I think this is what kind of the main point of what I want to tell you today, which is that there's this mutually reinforcing, there's this dialectical relationship between ideas and power. And I mean, we're going to overuse Gramsci throughout TWT this week, I think. But that relationship is particularly important at moments of crisis, at moments between the old dying and the new emerging. And that is the moment that we find ourselves in today. After 2007, after the collapse of the debt bubble, you find our politicians scrambling to try and do what David was saying, bail out the old debt by creating new debt, inflating asset prices through quantitative easing, reviving the labour market by massively reducing wages, which has led to an immense amount of suffering, as Dawn was saying, throughout our country over the last 10 years. So given all the interests and all the power that underlies austerity, it's perhaps unsurprising that Britain's establishment media has stuck its neck out to defend the old order. But coming back to this point that we are at this moment of crisis, we are at this moment of massive change, they may have signed their own death certificate in doing so. Because I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the British left is currently going through not just, it's not just increasing, we're not just seeing more kind of vibrant activity going on at the CLP level, at the national level. I don't think it's an understatement to say that the left is going through an intellectual renaissance of the kind that you maybe had to go back to, the 19th century, in Britain to find before. And now ultimately, of course, we know that this intellectual renaissance, we know that these ideas aren't going to be the thing that allows us to win the age-old battle between labour and capital. If Reinhardt and Rogoff had been proven wrong immediately, then it wouldn't have stopped austerity. But it would have changed things a little bit. We won't convince the capitalists around to our side. We can only take control of the state and use it to boot them out. But in order to get there, we need to build this movement that has started to emerge in the UK today. And we're still far short of consolidating the alliance that will allow us to do that will allow us to take control of the state and fundamentally transform power relations in this country. Because what we are really, what the Labour Party represents are the interests of those who live off work rather than those who live off wealth. That's 90% of people in this country. And what we see today is a social movement that is aimed at mobilizing those people. And how do we do it? Everyone in this country today knows that something is wrong. You see it everywhere. You see it in, whether it's the rise of the far right, whether it's people protesting on the streets, whether it's just people knowing that they can't make ends meet and they're borrowing more than they have before. But there isn't that grand, overarching narrative to help them make sense of it. And that's where we come in. That's where ideas come in. That's where Tribune comes in, for me. I mean, the mainstream media in that context is letting us down. It's not reflecting any of the conversations, the exciting conversations that are going on at TWT here today. And that's why we need Tribune. When we leave here today, we will go back to a world that is hostile to our very existence as a movement. Having Tribune is carrying around a reminder that we are part of something big, something organized, something smart, and something that has the ideas that are ultimately going to win the day. Something that's going to change the world. There's a statue that's just gone up in London. There was a lot of fanfare because it was the first statue of a woman. And emblazoned on it is something that I see, and it kind of picks me up every time I see it. It says, "Courage calls to courage everywhere." And for me, Tribune is what is going to call to socialists everywhere. So thanks very much.
Well, friends, sisters, brothers, it's incredible to be back in the Socialist Republic of Liverpool. Now, I just want to do quickly, firstly, given I've got the mic, I can embarrass people, which is one of the great privileges of having a mic. The world transformed, I think history will record, will have played a critical role in the revival of socialist ideas and of socialist strategies. Each year, more imaginative, more vibrant, more inclusive, but the amount of effort that goes into it, the sleepless nights of those volunteers and the huge amounts of time and effort that they give up, having to deal with annoying people like me who don't turn up on time. So please give them a huge round of applause. And secondly, now momentum activists who played such a critical role in this and in so much of the last 3 years, mobilising people. The videos they do, which during the general election, 1 in 4 voters saw, and in key seats that Labour won, like the People's Republic of Canterbury, even more people saw them that. Very proud of myself to be part of the Unseat campaign, targeting seats like Boris Johnson and Ian Duncan Smith so we can kick them out and have a socialist government. So please give momentum activists a huge round of applause. And finally, Tribune. The refounding of Tribune, the relaunch of Tribune, is like coming up for air, which I'll explain why. And again, the amount of effort, the risks that have been taken to create a member-backed publication that can rival media organisations bankrolled by right-wing oligarchs. So give them a big round of applause, because this is history in the making. Now, This is why it's important. This is why it's important. Firstly, that point tradition that Ronan brought up, because that word tradition is often one monopolised by our opponents. And sure, our opponents have traditions, the traditions of the exploiters, of the oppressors, of empire and aristocracy, of the boss class, of those who subjugate women and minorities. They have their traditions, but we have our traditions as well. We have our traditions of the early trade unionists who fought for the rights and dignity of working people. The suffragettes, who are now lauded as secular saints, but in their day were dragged from demonstrations and thrown in dirty cells with tubes forced down their noses. The Chartists of the 19th century, the first great working class political movement. Those who fought for the NHS and the welfare state from the bottom up in the teeth of what seemed like overwhelming opposition at times from the powerful. Those who fought racism, sexism, homophobia, battened by police officers and spat at in the streets. The giants on whose shoulders we stand. And we've always got to remember those traditions, because we know that social change isn't linear. It's not victory, success, it's setback, defeat, and then victory. And to have a media, a institution like Tribune being refounded, to have organic links with the new movements that will transform this country and transform the world, is absolutely of critical importance. Another is, can I just slag off the mainstream media a bit? Sorry. Lovely lot. No, this is why it's important. We're often told, with finger-wagging intonations and the rest, that we have a free media. Now, in the sense the government does not control the British press, that's true. We're not North Korea. Not an ambitious place to start, I'm not going to lie. And what we have instead is the vast majority of the press run by a very small group of right-wing media moguls who defend a status quo, of which, of course, they are themselves inextricably part of, which they use their near monopoly on the main means of information to defend the interests of those at the top of society, of which, of course, they are themselves critical parts. Now, what do they do in practice? They, if you like, they are the gatekeepers of what's seen as acceptable in the political realm. Ideas, movements that challenge a broken, bankrupt social order are ignored or marginalised, demonised, and all of the rest. Ideas which, out there, with the actual public, are common sense, are a consensus. You know, like a think tank, a right-wing think tank last year did a study on support for nationalisation. Between 3/4 and 80% of people support the renationalisation of water, of rail, of energy, of the key utilities. Opposition to that is a fringe idea in public opinion. But in the mainstream media, even now, those ideas are treated as ludicrous, as far-fetched, as outside the acceptable boundaries of acceptable political ideas. It's the same with increasing taxes on the rich, for example, and investing in the public realm. All of these demonized and ignored and marginalized in the mainstream media. And then there's the other function of the mainstream media, and there are good people in it. It's a systemic critique we're talking about here, but it is the demonization, the relentless redirecting of people's understandable anger at the injustices that don't just scar society but define it, away from those at the top of society to people's neighbours instead. The politics of envy. They always throw that at us, the politics of envy. If you stand up for the bottom 70%, they call you a class warrior. If you stand up for the top 1%, they call you a moderate. But the truth is, it's the media themselves who constantly fan the politics of envy. If you're a low-paid worker, your wages have been slashed by your boss. Your in-work tax credits, your in-work benefits slashed by the government, and you're told, don't be angry with your boss, don't be angry with the government, instead be envious of the unemployed so-called scrounger down the road living in a mansion made out of widescreen television sets. Or they say to the private sector workers whose pensions have been decimated, one of the great scandals of our time, don't be angry with your boss, instead be envious of the public sector worker, the nurse, the teacher, the local authority worker, with their gold-plated pensions of $4,000 a year in a race to the bottom. Why should they have their pensions if you don't? They should be taken off them rather than to struggle for everybody to have those decent pensions. Or whether it be those who can't get a secure job because they've been stripped out of our economy by the policies of successive governments, by neoliberalism. Or they can't get a decent, secure home because of a housing crisis caused by the policies of those at the top. But they're told, don't be angry with the government. Don't be angry with that system. Instead, be envious, jealous of the immigrant getting the job or the home that shouldn't be yours. That should be yours. And they're telling people all the time, don't be angry that you're being robbed. Be angry that your less deserving neighbour hasn't been robbed quite as much as you have. And that is why, partly, because people never embraced this broken system. People felt this resignation, there is no alternative. But also that anger has been redirected systematically at those at the very bottom of society, those who themselves have suffered some of the greatest injustices of this broken and barren system. And that's why we need a new media. But that other reason, ideas. I'm so glad that's what Grace has talked about, and that's partly what I wrote in the article about a new Clause 4. Because back in 1947, free market ideology, laissez-faire as they called it at the time, had been discredited by the experience of the Great Depression, by the genocidal war that it helped unleash, by the experience of wartime planning and so on. And those who believed in those ideas were on the fringe. And they assembled in 1947 in a sleepy Swiss town called Montpellier. The likes of Milton Friedman, of Friedrich von Hayek, of Karl Popper, they were all there. But they didn't mourn, to use one of our phrases, they organised. They decided to lay the foundations for an offensive that would happen when the system fell into crisis. And Milton Friedman said that. He said, to get radical change, you need a crisis. And then the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. But he also said, I like quoting right-wing thinkers, he also said, though, that it depended on the ideas lying around. And they built those think tanks, as David Harvey so eloquently put it, all over the Western world. They were ready and prepared. And then when the international financial framework crumbled, partly because of the Vietnam War, when you had a massive oil shock in 1973, when that system began to totter, they were there ready and waiting, and they used that crisis to help refashion society in the interests of capital, in the interests of those at the top. But in 2008, when the crisis hit, the financial crisis, there were many on the left who felt that sense of schadenfreude at the time, almost. A sense that inevitably neoliberalism had been discredited, that from the ashes something would inevitably grow instead. But it didn't work like that. The left had ceased to exist as a mass political force with a coherent alternative because of the defeats of the 1980s in this country and elsewhere. because of the way the end of the Cold War was portrayed as the end of history. When it was said that it was easier to remember, it was easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism, but you could say the end of free market capitalism. So suffocating was the triumphalism of the 90s and so much of the noughties. So when the crisis came, we were in a defensive posture. We were saying, stop the cuts, stop privatisation. We weren't going on the offensive. But what's happened, as Grace has said so eloquently now, is we're bubbling with ideas. We're building this new intellectual foundations of a new society. But we've got so far to go. And that's what Tribune should be about. And what I wrote about in this new Clause 4, because Clause 4 in 1918 was written to commit Labour, which was never a socialist party. Tony Benn said it was never a socialist party, but it always had socialists in it. That in 1918 committed to bring the means of production, distribution, exchange under the ownership of workers to secure for them the fruits of their labour by hand or by brain. And that was a time of massive industrial struggle, of revolution sweeping, of course, across so much of the world, of revolutionary ideas, and that captured that zeitgeist. And there were attempts later by Hugh Gaitskell from the right of the Labour Party in the late 50s to scrap it, but huge resistance meant he couldn't. But in the 90s, because of all those defeats, Tony Blair was able to revise it to effectively surrender Labour to those neoliberal precepts of its opponents, just as Attlee forced the Tories of the 1950s and 60s to accept the underlying principles of what he'd done. But now this old consensus has collapsed. A new Clause 4 has to reflect that. It has to commit to a new socialism and a new mission of ridding this society from oppression, exploitation, violence, and bigotry in all of their forms. Now, just to wrap up on that, we've got to remember why we're all here. And it is because the social order is bankrupt and has forfeited its right to exist. One of the wealthiest countries in the world that can't satisfy the most basic needs and aspirations of its people. From the right to a decent, secure home, a decent, secure job. Neoliberalism said it would bring freedom, but instead it brought insecurity and trapped the individual in insecurity, robbing them of their own individual freedom, ironically. And that whole generation of people who are going to suffer a worse lot in life than their parents. But for me, looking back in the 1970s, the winter of discontent was always used as that iconic moment for the right of that old consensus collapsing. For me, do you know what sums up the barrenness, not the barrenness, the rottenness of this order? And I think what history will recall is when dozens of working class people burned to death in their home, in the richest borough, in the richest city in this country, in one of the richest countries that has ever existed, where they had warned that a disaster would happen which would kill them. And that's the only time anyone would listen. But we live in a society where working class people are demonized and ignored and marginalized. Where cladding was chosen because it was cheaper and flammable. Where there wasn't fire sprinklers in place because that costs money. Where there weren't proper fire regulations because that's red tape. That is a social order that doesn't just subjugate people's needs and aspirations to profit, but their lives. And history will recall that as the moment that this whole social order lost its legitimacy in this country. And that's why we're not fighting simply to replace a government with another one. We're fighting to replace a broken social order with a new democratic socialist society, run in the interests of the real majority, not the vested interests, who plunge this country into crisis after crisis and walk away whistling while the majority suffer the consequences and minorities are scapegoated for all they have done. Tribune will be at the vanguard of this, of laying the foundations for that new society. It will draw on the new intellectual strength of our movement, but also the movements that are struggling out there in our communities against those who have forfeited their right to rule. So let's build this as part of our movement, our collective movement. Let's make sure when we finish this conference in the coming days, we encourage people to subscribe to Tribune, to get that message out, and knowing that we are, like our ancestors before them, fighting against the oppression and exploitation that scars our society, but we are not nearly there, but that new democratic socialist society is within reach of our movement. So let's get out there, struggle, armed with its new ideas, and build that socialist society.
Okay, so we're going to do questions and answers now. I'll ask all of our panelists to keep responses short as they can, so that people have a chance to ask questions from the audience. So, do we have a mic going around the audience? Is there a microphone there somewhere? No? Okay, well, listen, put up your hands, ask questions if you have them. If they can't hear, I'll repeat them. Yes, first. Okay, we'll take 3 questions. That is a big one for our audience. Second question, anyone got one? Yes?
I was just wondering, I don't know what the panel's opinions are on Mark Fisher's idea of capitalist realism, but I was just wondering, in terms of sort of micro-scale of our movement, how we talk to people and convince them of the core logic of an anti-neoliberal idea, how we challenge these hegemonic ideas of there's nothing else we can do, oh, that would be nice, and I agree on a moral level, but practically it can't happen. Because such is the degree that even among liberal people who will support gay rights, black rights, they think just the means aren't there. So what on a personal level can we do to start making our ideas more hegemonic?
Right, thank you very much. We've had 2 men. Any women with questions? I can't. Yes. Okay. Okay, that's an interesting question. I'll refer that back over, first of all, to Owen, who, of course, has written the book on this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we don't call people that term. That term was about how we live in a society where, partly as I spoke about, working class people are demonised and airbrushed out of existence and so on. I don't know the social composition of the audience, if that's what you're asking, obviously. But I think one of the most important things that we're doing at the moment as a movement is going... one of the most important things we are doing as a movement, Labour have set up a community organising unit which is backed up by millions of pounds and resources, which is aiming to go to communities, working class communities, which were shattered by deindustrialisation and are being hit all over again by austerity, and they're training people across the country. And momentum involved very much in supporting that. That's the sort of thing we should be doing as a movement because, you know, I said I'm very much involved in the Unseat campaign, knocking on doors, which is very important, but we need to do community organising as well. We do need to fight for working class political representation. That's what Labour was founded to do in the first place. And that means, you know, the working class as it is today, the second biggest employer is, you know, because back in the foundation of the Labour Party, people were personal servants, dock workers, worked in factories, in mines, more likely now to work in supermarkets, in call centres and in offices. And because of the weakening of the trade unions, which was a route of getting people up the Labour Party to get political representation, like Nye Bevan, for example, who's grew up in a mining community, we need to rebuild those institutions to build that working class representation. So I can't talk about the audience, but we do need far more resources and debate about furthering working class political representation in this country.
And maybe David then on the question of obstacles to a socialist government. Only the small ones for David.
Well, you know, we'd be here all night if we went through a whole list. But I think one of the things we should immediately look to is the barriers that exist within ourselves. And I think that, you know, this goes back a little bit to the other question, which is to what degree we're able to educate people around us in various environments and situations to new ways of looking at the world. And actually some of these ways which exist in a socialist or Marxist tradition are actually very consistent with common sense. one of the problems is that highly educated people have been actually educated into bad sense. And we actually, having tried to teach Marx in a prison, everybody looked at me and said, "Why are you coming here telling us that? We all know that." And the privileged students at Johns Hopkins refused to believe it at all. So, you know, you have to adapt your strategies to whoever you're talking to and recognize that if you can root something in daily life and bring the concept into daily life in a very meaningful way, then things tend to fall together more easily. And you know, my own experience with, for example, the Marx lectures online. I mean, I've been amazed at how far they've got and how far they've gone. I mean, I've been shocked by that whole experience, and I think that we can do a lot more of that because you don't know exactly what works, and yet things sometimes do and sometimes don't. But I think we have to be experimental, very experimental with our approach, at the same time as we have a consistent vision. So it's a bit like, you know, you've got the vision and you know where you want to go, but you've got to realize that there are all kinds of devious ways to get there, and whichever devious way works, you follow it. And I think, again, we should be willing to be more experimental and sometimes, to some degree, be prepared to fail sometimes, and then learn from the failure. So that's the only advice I can give on that front.
Thank you. We'll take a few more questions now. Back there. Okay, perfect. Wait 1 second. Microphone coming to you. Back here. And I can barely see up here. There's a blue T-shirt, right?
Hi, this is a question for David, but I'm going to build on what Grace pointed out, because you said we almost need to reintroduce the grand historical narrative so we can inspire people. It's almost kind of like, let's bring back teleology and say, not having teleology as some rigid endpoint which we will inevitably end up in, but as a potentiality horizon which we can aim towards. So, David, you mentioned you want to see the socialist utopia by the time you're 90, which, if I counted correctly, is 2025. So on that, thoughts on fully automated luxury communism?
Okay, do you have questions over here? Microphone to this gentleman here.
Thank you. Question really to the panel more broadly is, how do we reset a Labour Party that partly is made up of individuals, typically within the parliamentary element of it, that wishes to protect that which we want to reset?
Thank you very much. And yes, over this side. If there's a microphone to this man at the front.
Okay, I'm holding a copy here. I so want this to succeed. This is wonderful. And if it succeeds again, a luxury magazine suddenly becomes popular in the same way vinyl records came back, despite everyone's things. That'll be marvellous. But seriously, guys, how confident are you that you're going to actually succeed and get this to reach the audience we need it to?
Sure. So I suppose I'll answer that one, and then I'll tee up the other two for Dawn and Grace. You know, confidence, I think in the publishing world these days, it's pretty hard to have it, right? A lot has changed over the last number of years. It's difficult to put these things together. But we put a lot of work into the foundations. I think the model actually of doing a print publication, which is one where you can get a subscription base, which you can then use to do things like pay writers, like have union printers, which was something we decided to do from the off, is essential, because you start online. It's a big thing now, right? Everyone talks about starting online and how easy it is to do, and the huge number of projects have done that in the last few years, and then they've no revenue model, and it's really difficult for them to actually sustain themselves and grow. And if you want to be an institution, and my view is, if you want to challenge the structures of the mainstream media from the left, you have to have an institution, you have to have something that can sustain itself over years, that isn't just people doing it kind of as a hobby or whatever. And let me tell you, I've worked on a load of media projects where I was doing it like that and not getting paid for it and whatever. But we need an institution in order to be able to challenge the media environment. And this is our way of getting there. We're backing ourselves to do it, but obviously we need all of you to subscribe. So on the way out the door, on all exits, there will be people who are selling issues and also have subscription forms. I know Pascal was up here earlier talking about exact change. Sorry, we don't have another solution to that. But if not, you'll find us also on tribunemag.co.uk. So I'll pass on to Dawn and Grace for the other questions from the audience.
So there was a question about how we deal with the PLP. I think that links to the question that was asked before about the barriers that exist to socialism in this country. I don't think it's the PLP themselves, but what I do think is the power in this country is exercised by a tiny elite that pervades all the institutions of government. And they are organized to, some extent by the hegemonic capitalist force today, which is financial capital. And which has kind of, since the financial crisis, that model, that financialized growth model that we pursued based on debt peonage, whereby, people, what made the model sustainable? People were repressed, people weren't able to come out and protest. They were also given, access to housing that made them buy into the model. Their pensions were privatized, making them buy into the stock market. This financialized growth model it's everywhere. It's in our governments, it's in our homes, it's in our companies, which increasingly run in the interests of shareholders rather than anyone else. So all these barriers are kind of, they coalesce and they create a particular structure of power in our society, a particular form of political economy. And in the Labour Party, if we fail to revive that countervailing force that has always existed and that will never go away, that is resisting those changes, the force of people who live off work rather than people who live off wealth. If we fail to do that, then the internal power inside the Labour Party will come to reflect, as it did in the Blair years, the prevailing power in wider society. And you see, the Labour Party's historically always been, funded primarily by unions. But in between the 80s and the 2000s, we got more funding than ever from individual donations, from, bankers, from all these sorts of things. And that shapes the priorities of the people who are supposed to represent us, as well as all the stuff that you get in the mainstream media, as well as the more subtle lobbying that takes place every day, and as well as, the fact that the particular economy we live in shapes people's interests to make them want to sustain it. So this is why democratizing our party is so important. We face a set of entrenched interests that exist across the spectrum, exist within ourselves, exist within every part of the economy. And things like, what we're not gonna have it this year, but hopefully we will one day have a democratic party with open selection, with low thresholds for leadership nominations, which will ensure that the people that are supposed to represent us, the Labour Party, which is as I said, the political representatives of the interests of Labour, is accountable to us and not to them.
On troublesome people in the PLP, I think just let the members decide. Open selections, I think that we need more of a say in who our elected representatives are, especially considering my MP is Kate Hoey. So just that, simply. On barriers to kind of full socialism, I suppose, I think one of them is, the biggest one is work, and how work has become more atomized, how work has changed over the years. My father gave me lots of terrible advice, and I would never, I'd never give it to you unless it was good. But the one thing that he did say that was good was that when I started my first job, he said that every time you start a new job, find out two things. First one, where are the toilets? Second one, who is your shop steward? And he was in a very unionised workplace. He worked in the Boeing factory in Belfast, and they've recently managed to stop the entire factory from closing because they were so heavily unionised. My first job was in Asda, which has just been bought out by Walmart when I was 15. And in my induction, I was told, because I was legally required to be told, that there was a Unite branch in the Asda that I worked in, but that for a smaller amount of money, I could join what they called the Walmart Job Club, which was exactly like the union, but cheaper. and run by the bosses. And I did not. But it kind of showed where that was going. It showed that union busing was becoming much more of a thing. And also, I was on a 0 hours contract, which back then, I mean, the first 3 jobs I had were all 0 hours contracts before they were trendy. And now, so many people I know are on 0 hours contracts. So many people I know are freelance, but are essentially working full-time jobs because their bosses don't want to pay pension contributions, they don't want to pay sick pay, they don't want to pay maternity pay. And that means that, A, they're earning less and they're constantly struggling. It also means that the traditional models of unions aren't working for them because they're working from home, or they're often struggling to make ends meet because literally nobody will pay a fucking invoice on time. So if you get to the end of the month and you're trying to pay your rent and you're also trying to pay your £30 union fee, you're going to have to cancel that direct debit because it's going to bounce. So I think that we need to look at new ways of unionising people. And I think that, often people say that unions are past it, etc. But all we have to do is look at what happened with the university strike this year. If there are any university teachers in the audience, well done. And that nearly brought, vice chancellors to their knees. And that involved a huge amount of work from a lot of teaching staff who were on 0 hours contracts, who were paid absolutely fuck all for teaching students, while vice chancellors take home absolutely huge amounts of money. And they stuck their neck out for their colleagues who had better terms and conditions for them, just because they knew that when it comes down to it, solidarity is a two-way process. So I think that we need to look at new ways of unionising. I think we need to look at new ways of working collectively, both in terms of volunteering, but also kind of community organising. So that's...
Thank you, Don. That tees me up very nicely to something I'd like to say just briefly here, which is in terms of the trade union movement and Tribune. Tribune sees itself as a movement publication. And what I mean by that is we don't see ourselves as a media operation that exists outside as some kind of external critic to the socialist movement. We see ourselves as something that will be embedded in it, in discussion with it, and part of it. And to that end, on our advisory board, in addition to David, will be representatives from Unite Trade Union, the Communication Workers Union, and we have a launch event. If you know anyone who couldn't get here tonight but wants to get to an event on Tuesday with Unite at 5 o'clock in Jury's Inn, and we would be delighted to have anyone who couldn't make it here tonight along to that one as well. We should wrap up now. We're right up against it. I'm getting gestures over here. I want to thank hugely the volunteers from the World Transformed who put this together. I want to thank you all for coming. Have a great conference. Go out there, fight, organise, and we'll be in discussion with all of you in the coming weeks. And thanks for your support for the New Tribune project. We appreciate it.